privilege to introduce Dr. Chris Winter, who's the Harold Bornstein Endowed Chair of Sleep Medicine at University of Virginia. For those of you who do not know Dr. Winter, he is sometimes referred to as the sleep whisperer, who I think he was endowed with that title by Ariana Huffington. But Dr. Winter did his medical training at Emory University for medical school training. He was then at the University of Virginia for his neurology residency, where he also served as chief resident and worked with Paul Surratt. And then went on to do a sleep fellowship training at the University of North Carolina with Brad Vaughn. I think you were mentioning last night at dinner. I think early at the start of your sleep career, Dr. Winter worked with Paul Surratt, and I didn't realize this until I was looking at your CV a little bit, but you did a little bit of physiology work. So from a pulmonologist to a neurologist, then you get some street cred. By working with the pigs and experimenting with the lateral walls of the pigs. But during that time, he developed his interest in sleep in elite athletes, and published a paper in, I believe, 2009, something like that. Okay, and which really looked at the advantages of being in circadian synchronization and its effects on performance in Major League Baseball. And with that, then he became very well recognized and has been a consultant for a number of major professional sports teams, including Major League Baseball, such as the San Francisco Giants, Pittsburgh Pirates, LA Dodgers, Philadelphia Phillies, and even our own Cleveland Guardians. He's also been involved with the NBA, with OKC Thunder and some other teams, and with the NHL as well. So he's really sought after in terms of his expertise, in terms of optimizing our performance in athletes. He's also well published as a writer of a few well-known books, one on sleep solutions and why your sleep is broken and how to fix it. And most recently, another book looking at written about the rested child. And more recently, he's getting into the podcast area and has a well-known podcast that's called Sleep Unplugged, and it's about a year old.
It is. It's a year old today.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're honored to have you here, and you will be talking to us about the science of athletes and the veteran.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I hope everybody can hear this. If I sit, maybe is it better? Yeah, so I'll sit. Why sit when you can?
If you want,
you can stand when you
you
can
can
sit.
put the mouse on that table if that's a little bit.
Yeah, that's great too.
Yeah.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
I see that a little bit like that. Yeah. So, well, thank you for that introduction. It's very kind of you. I'll There we go. This is so there is no such thing as the Harold Bornstein Endowed Chair. I just made that up to feel like I belong with you all. I'm in actually private practice. This is Harold Bornstein. He was the doctor that proclaimed Donald Trump to be astonishingly excellent. So I've always considered myself to be the Harold Bornstein chair of sleep medicine and neurology because of my astonishing excellence, even though there's no proof to that effect. So yeah, so I work in a private clinic with a nurse practitioner. We do sleep in adults and peds and love it, but I have no real academic credentials here. You guys are much smarter than I am. You mentioned Paul Surratt. The whole reason I'm here was back in the early 90s. I came to college thinking I would be a doctor, but I knew nothing about that. And my biology advisor said, hey, there's some doctors looking for help with their research. And Paul was one of them. And so I looked at his little ad he had made for everybody, in terms of, here, if you'd like to learn about sleep and breathing. And I thought that sounded great. And Paul was not only a great scientific mentor, but he was like a father figure to me when I was in college. I lived with him during the summer and still feel very close to him. And the first time I ever heard Case Western was because he talked about that's where he went to medical school, and I always thought that was a cool name. And So that's me back in '92. We were trying to figure out if sleep apnea independently created issues like high blood pressure, or was it really more related to things like obesity? And so we were putting little breast implants and then balloons in the lateral pharyngeal fat pads of the pig, so we could give them horrible sleep apnea one night and no sleep apnea the next night. And the biggest challenges we had with the pigs, number one, they wouldn't keep their masks on at night. So I designed a mask that's never been patented to my knowledge, that had corn chips and lard in a little compartment I made in the front. So the pig would constantly be trying to reach the lard and that he couldn't find. The other problem we would find was that we would put their pulse ox on their tail. And as the night would go on and their bodies got a little cooler and their tail got cold, it would lose the signal for the pulse ox. And so I sewed these little flannel cozies in college. I would get flannel material and Velcro and sew these little things. You wrap around their tail, which put the pulse ox on there. So that was my introduction to sleep medicine, and I never intended it to be a career, but the people in it are so nice, the field's so much fun, there's a lot of interest in it that I just never left. So here we are. Sleep's fun if you're out there and you're training and trying to figure out what's next. You know, being in this space is really an interesting one. This was me sleeping in a cave to figure out how temperature affected sleep. We wrote an article about that, and I was really interested in sleeping on a portaledge, and it took me 2 years to find a guy that would do it with me. So I went to Seneca Rocks, West Virginia, and portaledge for me. We climbed this thing, and he put me up there and he said, listen, I'm going to give you a little cook stove and some noodles. Don't set this thing on fire because you have nowhere else to go. So what was really interesting was that was many, many years ago. I was out in LA doing some filming for something else, and this woman came up to me and she said, if you could do any project at all, what would you do? I said, well, I used to do these little articles about sleeping in unusual places, ice caves, haunted houses, portaledges. I think that'd be a fun show. So we actually filmed a show called Sleeping Around, and you can see it on sleep.com. It's totally free. And so we recreated that portaledge out in Colorado. So that's me climbing there on the bottom. And you can see the portaledges up on top. And I'm going to climb with this woman named Sasha DeJulian, who's this famous Red Bull international climber. And we spent the night on this portaledges out in Estes Park, Colorado, which was just awesome. And right around that time, my credit card company said, hey, you need a new credit card. You want to put a picture on it. So that's the picture on my credit card right there. That was the sunrise that morning when we woke up, and it was the best cup of coffee I ever had. So anyway, sleep's fun, and I hope that you all find it to be the case. I've never met somebody who's in sleep medicine and is miserable. So we'll talk about some things today. I wanted to talk about my work I do with professional athletes, and maybe look at the history of that a little bit, which is kind of fun. And then what we do in terms of how we assess teams and players, and maybe some work that we could do for them. And I'll tell you right off the bat, if this is something of interest to you, there's so many teams and need, so much need out there that there's not enough sleep doctors to go around. So you look at collegiate performance programs and professional, and it's just, there's a tremendous amount of interest in that space if that's something you're interested in. And then what do we do for athletes if they'll allow us to do anything? Back in 2017, Sports Illustrated put out a list of the best things in sports: best uniforms, best teachers, coaches, best stadiums, and they had the best secret weapon in sports. They wrote was sleep. I thought it was steroids myself, but it's actually sleep. And you can see that's the Dodgers down there. You don't see me. I'm in the middle of that group of players. I'm not so I've worked with the Dodgers for a long time, and so that was a little article about how teams are looking to sleep to kind of create more athletic performance and get the most out of their players, which was a lot of fun. So here's some teams that I work with, and I'm not a huge sports fan, actually. I don't really follow the teams a whole lot or really know a lot of the players, but I do like the idea of working with a body of people that are so scrutinized. So when you do make interventions or changes with their sleep, unlike maybe working with school teachers, you can see very quickly if your interventions are helping or hurting, because these players are studied so carefully. So I've always viewed this whole situation as kind of a lab. we'll tweak this or we'll travel in this way and see what happens. And so sports kind of offer a great window into some of the physiology and the changes that we're doing in terms of sleep. I'm very good at losing World Series. I'll put that out there. So we lost the World Series with Cleveland back in 2016. The Dodgers lost twice on my watch, finally won one a couple of years ago. And then more recently, last year, the Phillies lost to Houston. So just know what you're getting as I talk to you, that I'm not necessarily good at closing the deal when it comes to performance and winning championships. I like to think about sleep in sports, and I often think about the athletic trainers and the coaches as sort of being maybe the first people to really look at sleep in athletics. This is James Robinson. He was actually the first athletic trainer in recorded sports history. So when you look at James Robinson, I often think about him thinking you're working with the Harvard football team there and making sure that they're doing things that are going to lead to beating Yale or whatever you do when you're the athletic trainer of the Harvard football team. As time passed, the athletic training world became more formalized, and Billick was an athletic trainer who actually wrote sort of the first comprehensive book on what we do to take care of athletes, and it's called the Trainer's Bible. There's parts of it that are still in existence today, and the best part of it is he references sleep 20 times in the book. And my favorite references are up here. Under stress, let's see if I can move this real quick here. Under stress of this coming, I think, athletic endeavor.
Oops, you get the minimization.
Under stress of a coming contest, athletes frequently sleep poorly and then worry about possible deleterious effects. I don't think anything could be more truer today. How many players will talk about, I get really nervous and sleep poorly when I pitch, and certainly our patients who are not elite athletes have that same sort of feeling. So Philip was very keen on recognizing that even back then. A relatively poor sleeper should have a room to himself. Separate beds are preferable. Love the idea of back in the day when you traveled to play your teams, you actually shared beds with teammates, not just rooms. Athletes rarely sleep soundly when doubled up with strange bedfellows. And then my favorite, the glass full of port wine followed by a beer 15 minutes later can be helpful in knocking out a hyper excited athlete. So I love the idea that they were timing it out. Maybe we should do the beer first and then the port after 30 minutes. No, that's no good. And they figured out that it was the wine before beer in the clear 15 minutes and you knock people out. So I love the idea that people were thinking about these types of things even way back then. So when I worked with Paul as an undergraduate, we had a conversation that I remember very closely that I thought, well, it'd be really interesting if you looked at the travel of sports teams and tried to figure out if there were trends or things you could use to be predictive of their performance. And I remember him looking at me saying, Chris, that's a really good idea for a project. He said, that's the great thing about sleep, is that if you dream something up, there's a very good chance it's not been done yet. It's such a new field. And then I remember him sort of turning around and just walking away like that was like, I'm not going to do it, but it's a good idea. So when I finished all my training in 2004, the Montreal Expos were playing half of their baseball games in San Juan, Puerto Rico. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. For the first time, Major League Baseball is being played across 5 time zones instead of 4 because Puerto Rico is Atlantic time. So we actually looked at this. And so I started researching this, and there was some research that was already out there about sleep and sports. And Dr. Reck did a great study on Major League Baseball where he felt like home teams were scoring a few more runs than visitor teams when they had just completed eastward travel. It was a very elegant study that he did. There was an NFL study looking at Monday Night Football. So back in the day, Monday Night Football was always played on Monday night at 9:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, regardless of where the game was being played. And so they figured out in Monday Night Football, the West Coast team was going to win more often by more points. because of the timing of that game being so late on a Monday night, that you would have an advantage if it was happening a little earlier in terms of your circadian time. And there was a Steenland study looked at visiting teams traveling east, scoring more points than when they would travel west. And so there was some research that was kind of already out there before we started looking at what we did. And so I remember learning pretty early on that when you travel, for every time that you travel, it takes about 24 hours to adjust. There's newer research that would say when you're traveling west, it's about 54 minutes you're going to adjust. And then when you're traveling east, I think it's something like 92. So we tend to struggle a little bit more when we're coming east, just because it's harder to advance the cycle, go to bed early, eat early than it is to actually delay it. So we kind of divided up everything. We thought about, okay, let's pick a team like the San Francisco Giants. They're out on the West Coast. If you roughly divide the country here into our time zones, when the Giants are at home and are acclimated to home, we consider them to be at a circadian time of 0. So no matter where you are, if you're there, you're kind of activated. And as with every time zone that you would travel, if the Giants flew east and played Atlanta, they would be 3 hours off for the first game. They go to bed, 24 hours later, they would wake up, they would be 2 hours off, go to bed, wake up, 1 hour, go to bed, wake up. And now after 3 days, they're in Atlanta, they're completely adjusted. So they're essentially an East Coast team at that point. And that was what a lot of the studies prior to that had not done. They sort of treated San Francisco as a West Coast team, no matter what, where they were. And that's not really a great way to look at it, because once they're out there, they're acclimated. So if the Giants fly from Atlanta up to play, Cleveland, they're still at time 0 until they fly back to San Francisco, at which point they're now 3 hours off the other direction. So we kind of created that convention, sort of a negative number meant westward travel and a positive number meant eastward. So what you looked at was when you put everybody together and started the season off, theoretically, everybody was at 0. The Giants flew out to play the Nationals in DC, and the Braves flew out to play the Dodgers in LA. The Braves would be 3 hours off for that first game. The Giants are 3 hours off in the opposite direction for the first game. And with every passing day, they're becoming more and more activated. So after 3 days, everybody's on even footing again. So then you get these kind of weird situations where the Giants would now fly back home to play Atlanta, who's just come from LA. Now the Giants, who are the home team, are actually much more non-acclimated than the visiting team. And what was really interesting was when I presented this research in Minnesota, I had a guy come up to me from the University of Michigan, and he said, "This is really interesting." He said, "Your calculations are really close to being accurate." And I thought that was an interesting thing. I said, "Do you look at this?" He said, "No, but bookies do." And he said, "I used to work for a bookie." So I went to college, studied math, worked in Vegas for a bookmaking group, and then went back to graduate school, which is where he was. And so he said, these were kind of the calculations that we would use. So it was really interesting thinking you discovered something and realized that all these Vegas odds makers had already kind of figured that out. So if you're a gambling person, you get into trouble and you need a sure bet. If you look through the Major League Baseball schedule, these are the ones to look for, where a home team is actually very off from their schedule because they've recently traveled. The visiting team is there. So I'm not encouraging you to gamble. But those are the good ones to look for. So we came up with a term. So in this situation, the Giants, who were in San Francisco, have the home field advantage, and we said that the Braves had the circadian advantage. I think that was the name of the term we called it. And so with every passing day that they're there, the circadian advantage becomes diminished until it's gone and everybody's fully activated. So we started looking at this. We looked at the 2004 season, and that's what we presented in Minnesota. And this is, you can kind of see, the teams here, and then the home team, in this situation is, one time zone off in terms of their acclimation, and the visiting team is different, and then what the outcome of the game was. It was mind-numbingly boring and awful to do. And then when we presented at Major League Baseball, said, "This is really interesting. Could you look at 10 years for us, and we'll fund you to do it?" So at that point, I hired a research assistant. He said, "I can't look at these anymore." So from 1997 to 2006, that was the scan that we looked at. there was 24,121 individual games that had to be looked at to figure out where they were in their travel, that they, deviated from their norm. So it was, I remember one time Noah was my research assistant calling me up and saying, I didn't finish as much as I thought I would today because I've got a terrible headache. Can I just quit? I'm like, absolutely, take all the time you need. The great thing too was Noah presented this research at a sleep conference that I did not go to. And I gave him all my credentials, which was sort of funny. And so he was walking around with Dr. Noah on his thing and everything. And he called me at one point and said, I'm getting ready to do my presentation. I forgot socks. Is that going to be a problem? He had his suit on, but no socks in his dress shoes. So, so that was the best phone call ever. So anyway, so we presented it. And so basically, as you can imagine, the more difference there is between the time zone that you're acclimated to and being off in terms of your opponent, the more likely you were to win or lose. And so it was pretty linear in that. We published that. It was a lot of fun. And so after that, we published it. I got a phone call from the San Francisco Giants who I was in clinic one day and was pretty sure it was a prank. And they called up and said, hey, look, we travel all the time. And it was interesting because when I did that presentation, the 10-year presentation was in Colorado. And the local Colorado news picked it up, like the Skip Jackson Action News was at the conference, and he saw our research, and he said, yeah, there's a researcher in Virginia. And at the end of my presentation, I just said something kind of dumb. I said, and this is the reason why the Colorado Rockies will never win the World Series, because they're the one baseball team that's in mountain time. So no matter who Colorado is playing, as soon as they get on a plane and leave, they're leaving their time zone. They're the only team that's like that I'm aware of. Even in basketball, there's the Utah Jazz, Colorado, Denver Nuggets, and there's another one too, Phoenix Suns. But in baseball, there's only one. So I made that comment. And so he said, and there's a researcher in Virginia who says that we'll never win the World Series because of this. And so the San Francisco Giants happened to be in a hotel lobby waiting to get on the bus to go to the field in Colorado, and they saw that and called me and said, we'd like to talk more about this. And I was like, well, I don't really know any more than what you've shown, but I'm a sleep doctor and I can try to help you out. And so that was in 2008. We came up with all kinds of interesting things to do with their players and their travel. And then they won the World Series in 2010, 2012, and 2014. So then people started calling. So there's nothing like dumb luck in a career, being in the right place at the right time. So it's been a lot of fun. So it's, as fun as it was in the research, it really rests on the shoulders of some really interesting research that happened in the past. And so it was fun to do all this stuff and kind of look at these types of things. And the great study by William Colquhoun in 1971, who wrote about biological rhythms in human performance. And even though there was no specific reference to sporting events, he did talk about sort of the idea that during a 24-hour period, different things are going to have peaks and valleys and troughs and whatnot. So mood and reaction time and memory and alertness is going to exhibit that sort of change. And Conroy wrote in 73, he looked at 30 swimmers, runners, and shot putters and said, basically, the improvement, they're going to be better at between 5 to 7 p.m. than they are at 7 to 8 a.m. And he looked at a lot of Olympic athletes because you have this sort of beginning qualifying round in the morning. Swimmers are the same way. And then if you qualify, you go on and perform in the afternoon. So it's a very elegant way to sort of look at timing. And when you look at all the world records of running and swimming, they typically happen later in the evening. It's thought that that's sort of when people sort of peak. Thomas Riley looked at this in terms of higher level swimming and cycling, included in 83, that for swimmers, their maximal swim times are best in the evening versus the morning. So you have to get through the morning trials to actually get to swim in the evening. So my son swam at Navy. He was a big swimmer in high school. And it was always interesting to look at the kids who were really good in the morning. You had to get up at 4 a.m. every morning to swim. So they sort of practiced to be athletically great at 4 a.m. And that's when they were really swimming. And then the exception was the meet, which would happen at 7 p.m. At 7 p.m. he was always doing homework. He wasn't swimming at that time. So a lot of athletes started looking at Thomas Riley's research and saying, why don't we train athletes early in the morning like swimmers or rowers when their competitions are always later in the evening, should we be training during the time where we want people to perform maximally? And that's where Bill DeMint actually looked at, well, what is the peak time for athletic performance in a young athlete? And he did this study with Dr. Smith and said, yeah, again, 3 to 6 p.m. is sort of that athletic peak time, which is also incidentally typically our temperature peak time too. When you look at temperature curves of young people, 4 o'clock is typically when they're sort of hitting their peak and then falling after that.
Is that when Olympic records and world records are typically set in the,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, I guess it's hard because it's probably
The
pro.
biggest issue is when you look at sort of more regional meets, that relationship is seen much better. When you look at things like the Beijing Olympics, there's often really interesting things that happen with athletes, particularly swimmers, because they're put at a very big disadvantage. There was an Olympics one year, I would say it was probably 2 or 3 Summer Olympics ago, where they had a young woman who was a swimmer who was expected to be like the equivalent of Michael Phelps at the games. She was going to win all the, and very quickly, like her first event, she finished 5th, and then it was interesting to watch the entire NBC programming switch because she was not having a great Olympics. And it really came out afterwards that there was very little preparation, if any at all, for her to perform in Beijing. You know, like that you're literally turning your schedule completely around, and nothing was really done to prepare for that. According to people who were within the Olympic training, that wasn't really on their radar. One of the things that I find really interesting is looking at the prototype, and when you look at individuals who are evening types or more neutral, they tend to be able to hold it together between the morning and the evening. There's not as much of a drop off when you bring morning people in. It'd be very interesting to find out more about that swimmer. You know, what does her chronotype, do some sort of assessment on her? Those individuals will eat you up in the morning, but you know, after 3 or 4 o'clock, their performance drops off significantly. And we actually looked at that in Major League Baseball players. The yellow shirts indicated players that were morning types, and the gray shirts were the night owls, and then the background is the day games. And so you can see that if you have a day game, the pitcher that's going to do best for you is the morning type, which makes sense. And as you move to the night, both of them have diminished performance, but you see the night owl's ERA doesn't drop nearly as much as the morning person. So for a pitcher, the lower the ERA, the better, earned run average. So this was an interesting thing to talk to coaches about, in that you have an important game that you must win. It's late at night, you know, it's going into extra innings. You're already 2 hours off from your own time zone, so it's feeling very late to you. And now you've got to bring in a new pitcher, you know, left-handed, right-handed pitcher, he's good with this batter or not. And this was just another idea or a metric of, hey, maybe considering whether they're a night person or a morning person might be really helpful in terms of their performance, not only at that point, but also, you know, what role are they playing? Like if you've got a closer who's always going to come into a game at 9 o'clock at night, it might be a good idea to make sure that person's a little more acclimated at that time. And we did the same thing with batters and showed that as the night went on, the night owls actually batted better. The morning types tended to struggle. This was a great study. It was an abstract that was just presented in Indianapolis by a guy who actually, Dr. Sidi, who is at VCU. And this was basically looking at when is it best to train a young athlete? And he's looking at these same sorts of things in terms of, you know, is it best to have your practice right after school? Or what about a later practice or a later game? And really kind of found that for individuals, you know, that later exercise tended to affect their sleep, which we talk about all the time. You know, trying to exercise right before you go to bed is probably not the best thing for falling asleep quickly or sleeping well. But he also looked at the individuals who were in the study and showed that if you were a night owl, you tended to do better with that later training or those later games. And so I always look at high school students and think about that with, you know, when you go to the high school graduation of your kid and there's a valedictorian up there and she's talking to me about it. And I was like, I wonder if is she the smartest kid in the school, or is she the one who is most aligned to the timing of the school? You know, had some night owls in my family, and they really struggled with that first period class. And so I always think that it's really interesting that, athletics are kind of leading the way in terms of thinking about aligning our bodies with our work. And if we're not aligned, what are some things we can do to make it so? This is kind of fun. This is the actual, each one of those bars is a player for the Cleveland Guardians organization. I think this is all of their professional players. I think virtually all of their high AAA players and maybe some AA players fit in there. So each bar represents a player. And so moving from left to right, the little black bar on the far left is the most night-oriented player on the team. And as you move from left to right, you go from the night owls to the intermediates to the morning types. And it's really interesting to follow. I think I've worked with Cleveland for about 10 years now. It's really interesting to watch a player come into an organization. The young players are often very night oriented. They like to stay up and play video games and go meet people in bars and stuff like that. And then as they sort of settle down and get into the system and maybe, find a partner and have some kids, they tend to move from left to right, which is what we talk about all the time. Young people have that delayed circadian phase in the morning. Your grandmother and grandfather down in Florida like to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, make a smoothie and go to bed at 7 o'clock, and they're real morning oriented. And you can see that happen over time. And I always think it's interesting if a player suddenly goes from being really morning oriented to suddenly back to being really night oriented, he's gotten a divorce. It's every time like, oh, all of a sudden you're like, wow, you're back to being Mr. Night Owl because you're dating, a 20-year-old who works in anthropology or something like that. And you've got this kind of fear in your face, you're excited but terrified all at the same time. So I think it's a good situation that we always do F-words and things like that on our players. If you do a little simple, we don't typically do the whole Horn Oscar and all 28 questions, although sometimes we do. We do a little shortened version that we kind of make up. It's not something that's validated or anything, but it is kind of fun to ask a few questions about chronotype with your patients. And if you kind of pick your 5 questions as they come back, do you see that change? And sometimes I think that a sudden change in chronotype can be an indicator of a problem. So the F-words you all know really well. We do F-words on all of our players and find that to be really interesting as well too. So that's a simple assessment we've done for years, and it matters. When you look at individuals who are restricted in their sleep, maybe have a higher Epworth score. It was shown that their bench press max, even after 4 days of restricted sleep, would drop by 20 pounds. They're making multiple, many more reaction errors when it comes to restricted sleep. And Sherry Ma, who's wonderful and is out in Stanford, did all kinds of really cool research about extending sleep. So what happens if we extend the amount of time a player is sleeping, or really more appropriately or more accurately, extend the amount of time you're giving a player to simply be in bed resting. She put the little house arrest bracelets on people and made sure that they were in bed for the requisite amount of time. You didn't have to sleep, you just needed to be in bed. And showed all kinds of interesting things. That basically basketball players were making more 3-pointers, improved by 9%. Free throws were improving by about the same amount. It's really fun whenever I go to visit a basketball team to look at their last 10 games. And of the ones they've lost, just giving them 9% more free throws and 3-pointers, not even a typical, regular basket during a game, just 3-pointers and the free throws, giving them 9% more for that game, and then seeing what the final score would have been. They almost always win the game. So that's kind of a fun way to kind of get to people and say, hey, look, these little performance increases with spending more time matter. Swimmers swam faster, they had quicker reaction times, their turns were faster, all kinds of improvements just in terms of speed with swimmers, which was really interesting. Hitting accuracy with the tennis team increased by 42%, even running speed was faster. So it's this idea that simply creating more space for sleep mattered. And we did a study looking at college football players. We pulled, I think, something like 500 NCAA college players from the ACC and looked at their sleeping scores. And there was actually a study by Dr. George looking at professional football players. They were actually Canadian football players because the NFL would not give them access to their players. They said, well, forget it, I'll just go up to look at some professional players in Canada. So this isn't exactly one-to-one, but you can see the Epworth scores of the professional players in red versus the Epworth scores of the collegiate players matched by position in blue. And this is why I think that there's just so much need for sleep professionals in collegiate sports, because once you get out of college, you don't have classes, you don't have all these arbitrary things. You literally just play your sport and go home and sleep if you want to. So I think that in terms of bang for your buck, if you're trying to talk to a collegiate football player or a football team around here and say, look, you got a lot of sleepy people on your team. If you could fix that and do something about it, you could probably make a big difference in terms of performance. We actually work with a women's crew team, and I did Epworth on all of them. 2 of the women on the crew team were in the normal range, and the rest were just, Epworths of 17 and 19, and one young woman, I think, was like still maybe the highest Epworth I've ever seen. In fact, when I gave the talk, I don't do this anymore, it's not as rude, but when I gave the talk, I said, I want you to take your pointer finger and point to the sleepiest person on your team. And they all went and pointed to that poor girl who was asleep while we were doing it, which was great. I never fault people for falling asleep during my lecture. In fact, I encourage it. But I thought that was amazing. And so we did all these kinds of things to help with their sleepiness, and they won the national championship, I think 2 years later, which was really exciting. So I think this matters. And it's fun to kind of look at this. This was a study that we did where we did all these Epworth scores on players. And then 3 years later, we looked for those players to figure out what they were doing. And if you were still in Major League Baseball, you got the little blue batter icon. If you were out of Major League Baseball for any reason, you're the sad little pitcher icon there. And you can see that as the Epworth score gets bigger, you're more likely to move left to right. In fact, when I did this study, I gave all my numbers to a statistician who worked at UVA. It was this Korean guy, who was lovely and didn't speak great English. And I sent it all to him, and a few days later, he sent me an email back and wrote, did you make these numbers up? Wow. I was like, no, I didn't make these numbers up. He goes, I just felt like I needed to ask. He goes, because they're profoundly significant. Which is funny, because I was like fudging data or something like that there. But I think it matters. I mean, I'm not a huge sports fan, but I think that in anything, if you're a pulmonary critical care resident, if you're a teacher, if you're an accountant, if you're walking around with an Epworth of 15, I think that the likelihood of you being able to perform at your best, stay healthy, be in your job for a long period of time is probably going to be diminished. So that was a fun study to do. The other big idea within sleep and sports is recovery. And I think Charles Samuels, who's a researcher up in Canada, really kind of brought recovery and sleep and athletic performance together and really paid attention to sort of, how is deep sleep affecting growth hormone secretion, and how is growth hormone secretion making you better able to play in your soccer game and recover from your lifting session and do all those types of things. So he's a lot of really good information about that out there. When I would work with teams, a lot of times they would sleep in unusual places. I'm usually sitting around in an athletic training center looking for something to eat. One time I opened up a closet to look for a bar, and I heard this voice go, "Get out!" And I looked down, and one of the players was sleeping in the closet with a towel wrapped up for a pillow. And I shut the closet door and left. And so one of the things I say to teams all the time is, your players are going to sleep or need places to rest and recover from. Why not find, make good places for them to do that? Because A, it's great to have a place to sleep, and B, it's a symbol like, hey, we as an athletic organization here in Cleveland really value sleep. So, there's all kinds of interesting little nap pods that people can get, it's look a little claustrophobic. That looks way too much like that submarine that just, had the terrible accident to me. So I would not want to be inside of that. But, I think that these things serve as a real powerful symbol that sleep is positive. That we're not hiding sleep. You mentioned Ariana Huffington. Nobody calls me the sleep whisperer, by the way. She said that one time. More people call me the guy that doesn't put the seat down than the person, the sleep whisperer, if we're going to be honest about things. But I love Ariana because she'll actually nap in front of all of her employees. She leaves her office door open, and she's like passed out in there. She really wants people to understand that sleeping, napping, taking 15 minutes and closing your eyes is not a sign of weakness, but it's intelligent. I think creating consistent environments for players to sleep are important. Helps to alleviate the fear of oversleeping. A lot of young athletes are terrified of missing their alarm. so terrified of you, they wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and they're kind of scared. It's like when you go and you travel and you have to catch a 5 a.m. flight, you're nervous, you're gonna oversleep in the hotel and wake up at 8 and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm stuck because I overslept and missed my flight. So they often have really a lot of fears around those types of things. And it allows the team to really control the environment, make sure it's a really good place to sleep and also track. This was the Pittsburgh Pirates napping room. This was a long time ago. The kid on the left is now 6'5" and just finished his first year of college. The kid on the right is getting ready to finish his last year at the Naval Academy. He's 6'4", I think. So they came with me to Pittsburgh. We had built a place for the Pittsburgh Pirates to sleep. And what was great was the team said, well, they said, we don't want to call it a napping room or a sleeping room because that sounds lazy. And so I said, well, you can name it whatever you want. So the next time I came back, they had named it the regeneration room. That was great. But if you look behind the little guy there, there's a little, sensor. So the player to get in takes their sensor and they would sort of, swipe it and go inside. So it was allowing it to be secure, but it was also allowing the team to track who was using it and who wasn't, because everybody had, their own card. And I got a call one time, 2 years later from the number crunchers within the organization. And they said, it is very clear to our organization that the players who are utilizing the regeneration room perform better. I was not involved in that research whatsoever. So, it's interesting when you deal with a lot of teams, there's so much research happening that you're either not aware of or you're not allowed to access or talk about, but they're constantly looking at all this kind of stuff, which is a lot of fun. So you don't get to, present a lot of stuff at scientific conferences because they won't give you the data, but you're around it a lot, which is kind of fun. And people really know what they're doing. It was funny, the little one asked me, what's a regeneration room? I said, well, sometimes in a baseball game, a player will slide into another player and they'll get their arm ripped off. And so they'll take the players to the regeneration room in between innings, and the scientists that work there, he can regrow an arm on that player, and then they can walk out and keep playing. And I said, you'll know it because usually the scientists will put like a sleeve on the player's arm to make sure that the sensitive skin and everything that they've regrown has a chance to heal properly. So for years, he would watch a baseball game oh my God, Derek Jeter got a new right arm because that sleeve like a so it's a lot of fun. And so this is a big topic. I think I forgot, but this was a research paper. I think it was 2020 by Dr. Grander, who's out in Arizona, and Jonathan is up in Canada, and they did a really nice review of how sleep and athletic performance kind of work together, and I thought they did a really great job with that. I love, in terms of things, interventions we do with players and maybe even what we do with patients. I'm a real big fan of biofeedback. I think a lot of players I just can't shut my mind off at night. It's a common thing with people too. And one of my favorite products is this Muse headband. It's made by a Canadian company, but I call it Interaxon. I have no financial relationship with them. And so you put it on and sit there and kind of meditate and try to get your mind to calm down. And it's measuring frontal electrical activity with this little, pseudo EEG device or whatever. And when you're done, you get this little printout. This was actually a middle infielder for the San Francisco Giants who said, I want to try it out. And so he tried it out and he scored 10% calm, which isn't that great. You want to get your line down there in that kind of red area. And he said, how did I do? I said, you were 10% calm. I said, that's pretty good for the first time. He said, how did you do the first time you do it? I said, I was about 28% calm. So you can see that was February 26th, 10 a.m. he left. Took my phone, took the device, just disappeared. I couldn't find him. My wife was trying to call me, but he was not answering the phone. So he took everything with him, and he came back 4 hours later, and he put it down on the table in front of me and said, beat that score. So what was great was in 4 hours, he started to learn what he needed to do to calm his mind down. And you can imagine he was the calmest guy in the world. So I love the idea for players and patients and whoever is struggling with sleep, this idea that, hey, we're not trying to shut our mind off, but we can work on things that allow us to calm ourselves better. For people who really meditate or really know a lot about that, this is probably irrelevant. But for a lot of people, when you talk about meditation or mindfulness, they have this sort of type A response of, I feel like I'm doing it wrong. Like it creates more stress to them. So I've always liked this little product because it allows, it's almost like meditation training wheels. Kind of allows you to do it, kind of turns it into sort of a video game. They actually made it in a pair of glasses for a period of time, which was kind of interesting. The best score I've ever gotten on this was a WNBA player. She said, "Can I try it out?" I was like, "Sure." She put it on and she wore it for a little 3-minute session and she was 92% calm. I said, "Wow, that's really impressive. How did you do that?" And she said, "I just imagined being in a gym and somebody kept throwing me a basketball that I can't quite see and I shoot it and it goes in. And I catch another ball and I shoot it and it goes in. I just did that." I said, "Why, what made you think to do that?" And she said, "I don't know, ever since I was a kid, that's what I did to go to sleep." So I love the fact that she had sort of created her own little mantra of quiet, poorly lit gym, catch a basketball, shoot it, do it over and over until you fall asleep. There's actually research that shows that an athlete who mentally rehearses an activity or a skill in great detail can actually make themselves physically better at it without ever doing it. Baseball pitchers do it all the time. They get shoulder surgery, so they will mentally pitch games with their mental performance coaches. And when they're able to start throwing again, they're much further along in the recovery, which I find to be really fascinating. So I really like that idea of, what are you going to do when you go to bed at night if you can't fall asleep? Like, what's your plan? You're going to read a book, you're going to worry about it, you can get on your phone, or you're going to sit there and shoot free throws. I told a baseball player, baseball player one time who couldn't, had trouble falling asleep. I said, "I want you to imagine yourself on the pitching mound and just throw 30 perfect curve balls or whatever you do, like to your favorite catcher. Imagine him there and the grass is green, the sky is blue." And the next time I saw him, I said, "How are you doing?" He said, "I'm not doing good." I said, "Oh, really?" I said, "The pitching exercise isn't helping you out much." He said, "Oh," he said, "well, that's the problem." He goes, "I get in bed and I throw like a pitch or two and I fall asleep. I've never made it to 30. I'm like, "That's okay, man. That's okay." That was no point. You kind of missed that. That's no problem. No problem with that. You can throw 28 extra real pitches. You know, nutrition and performance has always been sort of a thing. I always love the story of Gatorade. You know, before Gatorade hit the scene, this Dr. Hale, I believe, it's not Hale, it's Ron Hale, but he was this nephrologist, I think, down at the University of Florida. And he thought, well, maybe if we gave people more fluids and maybe replaced electrolytes, they'll perform better. Everybody thought he was crazy. And now, you know, you can buy Gatorade in a gas station convenience store. So I think sleep's sort of in that space of, it's kind of the new Gatorade, right? Like, you know, not everybody's really thinking about it. A lot of coaches think, you know, the earlier you get to the field, the later you leave, the better athlete you are. So we're kind of working on those kinds of concepts right now. And so it becomes a nice little ecosystem with, you know, nutrition affecting performance and hydration, and sleep affecting performance, but also the interplay between nutrition and sleep too becomes really interesting, particularly when players are flying to Dubai or to play some sort of match and come back. You know, so those things can be really important. And you know, thinking about different things and recommending teams in terms of sleep, things that can be helpful with sleep, or things that can be helpful away from it. So also, I think the sleep specialist spends a lot of time working with the nutrition people and sort of coordinating, okay, you're going to fly to Madrid and do these 2 preseason exhibition games and fly back. What's going to be served on the plane? How are we going to deal with jet lag? And so I think that's a lot of fun to kind of work in that space, even though I have a nutrition background. And I, you know, diet and everything kind of look at carefully. I'm going to go late here. Lighting is really interesting, both in terms of the athlete's professional life, what they're exposed to, but also the training centers. I work for the Boston Red Sox, and I was walking around inside their clubhouse right before a game with a little spectrometer. It's a thing that a photographer uses to look at light levels. And so we think about, you know, being more awake when you're in an environment with 2,000-3,000 lux. You know, go outside, it's 20,000 lux on a sunny day. The lux level inside the locker room for the Red Sox was 68 lux at its brightest point. Because you walk around, like, there's no windows, it's under the belly of Fenway. And I was like, you know, your players are coming in here in the hours before the game, you're kind of putting them to sleep. You know, this is a great setup for your visiting locker room. You know, you can make it super dim and whatnot. But so a lot of times, I think we as sleep experts have this seat at the table when it comes to designing a school or designing a locker room or a training center for a club. to make it sort of a healthier sleep space. And there's really fantastic lighting options out there that allow you to be in a certain environment, maybe before a game, but a very different environment after the game based upon the lightings that you do. And so that's a lot of fun to kind of think about. And there's all kinds of consumer options out there for lighting spaces. In all of our kids' bedrooms, we have light that has no blue green in it. So when they turn on the light, it looks like a regular light bulb. If you get a prism or a spectrometer and actually look at the light, there's no blue green in it. So as they sit there and do their homework, they're not keeping themselves awake theoretically. So there's all kinds of interesting options out there with that. And just being aware of a lot of the energy efficient bulbs are not full spectrum. So they may carry with them some positives and negatives. Thinking about sleep and travel, this is my favorite little travel device. It's called a Nap Anywhere. It unfolds to kind of cradle your neck. When you fold it up, it can fit into a computer bag really easily. And a doctor, he was a radiologist, designed it because he would always get a sore neck when he would travel. I used to have a picture of the United States men's basketball team sleeping on a plane. It was just amazing how many of them who rely on their brachial plexus for just completely have their heads and necks crammed into weird spaces and whatnot. So thinking about the team and these 6-8 individuals flying on a plane, or I really find that the minor league baseball teams on the little buses and stuff are really fascinating. They're crammed in there and sleeping on the floor, trying to go from one place to another on a bus. Temperature, I think, is a thing that we often think about, not only in terms of athletic performance, like we were talking about, but just monitoring and regulating temperature as a team travels to help them sort of adapt in terms of their performance. I always laugh that this is what my wife looks like at night when we get ready to go to bed. She hates this slide. She said, well, if you put that slide in there, you gotta say what you look like when you wake up. I always look like a sort of injured bunny because I'm freezing cold. So when you look at the body temperature curve where it sort of troughs or naders down there around 4 a.m., you're right a couple hours before we start to wake up. But if you're a night owl like me, everything gets shifted to the right. So her temperature is dropping, the morning person's temperature is dropping. So you're cold at night. I'm hot at night watching Stephen Colbert, my underwear, my dress socks, which is a lovely sight. But everything's flipped in the morning. So she starts to warm up early. She's ready to go to the farmer's market at 5 a.m. and buy some arugula. And I'm still on my downward side and feeling cold. So looking at those types of things and manipulating temperature can be a really interesting way of manipulating sleep. Actually, you got a thermometer during COVID. You stick it to your forehead and it registers your temperature. So one day where I knew I was traveling and I was going to be up very late because of the flight and everything, I took my temperature every 15 minutes and that's it right there. I thought it was kind of fun. So you kind of look at that sort of nadir and it kind of troughs a little bit further than I went to bed. So but anyway, fun temperature thing. So temperature manipulation with sleep, I think, is really, really helpful for athletes. They get really hot at night. I have athletes who say I wake up, I'm so sweaty, I have to take my clothes off and change before I go back to bed at night. They often have partners who don't want the bedroom nearly as cold as they do. So these little devices allow you to cool one side of the bed, not the other, can be really helpful for them. So this is the mattresses, I think, are really important for players. The sleep sheets they sleep on, the pillows they travel with. We were talking about that last night, that we often try to match pillows to these athletes and try to get a pillow specific for them, and then they lose it within 2 games of traveling. So we always make sure they have like bright neon orange pillowcases so they don't leave them in the hotel rooms when they travel with them. I'm a big fan of like weighted blankets, like up there on the left. I think they can be really helpful for people with like restless leg syndrome, or just in terms of calming. Is the reason why we swaddle little babies. We like that feeling of pressure on our bodies. It's a comforting feeling. So the weighted blankets have this sort of reputation for being in the sensory integration and autism field, which is fine. But I think that a lot of people can respond positively. So I always ask people, when you go to the dentist, they put the lead apron on you. How do you feel about that? If somebody says, oh, I really like that feeling, the little weighted blankets can be helpful. I've got restless leg from time to time, and that's my solution. I just go to a guest bedroom, drag out this super heavy weighted blanket and put it on mainly my lower half, and it really, really helps me to kind of make that feeling go away. We can talk about monitors and consumer tech. I'm positive about it. They have some accuracy issues at times. They're getting better. I think within our lifetime, these things will surpass a polysomnogram in some way or another. Players use them, so we think about them a lot. I did an experiment, but I put a bunch of them on my wrist and wore them for a month. And then that's a picture of me in my sleep center doing a sleep study on myself, because I was curious how well the data from those devices matched up to the sleep of the polysomnogram. And some of them were actually fairly close. And one day, actually, the entire day, I actually wrote down how many steps I took. I had a piece of tape, like a notebook around my neck with a pen. So if I walked from here to that door, I would count all day long, each step. So I was curious how close these step counters were. And I think one was within like 20 steps. It was really incredible. Couldn't believe it. So anyway, so there's a lot of devices out there that promise you amazing things for these athletes or whatnot. So, and then sleep studies are a big thing. We were just talking earlier, there's a player for the Cleveland organization who is interested in having a sleep study. I was talking to Dr. Green about that as well too. So they have a lot of misunderstandings about sleep studies, but the home sleep studies can be helpful for players who think they may have sleep apnea. I've always thought that teams could just purchase these things and use them themselves with their medical staff. A lot of advanced things that we're looking at in terms of the future about what we could see sleep being is in the future. I think injury is a big one. We've had a couple of clubs say that their own research shows that not only do their players who sleep better get better from injuries faster, but they're less likely to be injured in the first place, which is really interesting to me. Scott Kutcher out at Stanford did a study where looking at sleep related sort of cognitive performance and how well you judge a ball as being a strike or a ball. So we went back into this really interesting retrospective look at pitch evaluation and showed that it seemed to be related to travel. So I think there's all kinds of ideas of ways you can sort of integrate the ideas of sleep and sleep health into sports in the future. This was an interesting study we did with the college football players that showed that we had Epworth data on all the college football players and showed that the individuals who had better Epworth scores actually were better values in the NFL draft. So thinking about looking at the combine, how much can you bench press, how fast do you run? I think that if I were an NFL organization, I might ask a few questions about sleep and sleep habits and things like that. So because it seemed to be maybe potentially predictive in terms of how well they'll do, or you identify these individuals as being really sleepy and you maybe get them in the 6th round and your job is, okay, we got you at a value. Now we're going to bring you into the organization to figure out why you're so sleepy and maybe make somebody who's amazingly talented. You can make the NFL draft, even as sleepy as you are, make you even better by identifying those types of things. So that's it. I didn't want to go over. Those are my books. If you're interested in my Sleep Unplugged podcast is free. And if you have questions or see some stuff here in the chat, I'll pull up real quick. I don't know if there's anything to do with this. Yeah, let's see here.
Just maybe let's get out of this
Like
presentation mode.
That looks dangerous. I'm assuming that's the portaledge you were talking about. Surprised they advocated alcohol to like recycle players. Yeah, alcohol is just now being looked at as something that's not so great for sleep. I mean, everybody who's a sleep doctor still has people who come in like, I hear what you're saying about alcohol, but it just works really well for me, kind of thing. And I think that's that gray area of it's sedating you, it's not making you sleep better. And so that's a big thing with athletes. This year in Major League Baseball, there's actually a brand of CBD products that's sponsored by Major League, like has the official Major League Baseball. I mean, I just can't believe with gambling and CBD, like these things were illegal, 5 years ago. Now it's like, no big deal. Let's see here. I think there are really exciting implications for findings like this in other fields, medicine, executive, culture, small. Absolutely. That's John Carter. John Carter, wasn't that a movie? Yeah, John Carter. So yeah, I think that, to me, like I said, I'm not that interested in athletics, but I am interested to see what sleep can do. So I think what's nice about athletics are you can use that data, John, to go to Wall Street and say, hey, your stockbrokers, you're working around the clock and looking at things, and we can make them better. We can make you more able to predict trends and perform better at your stock job or whatever you do by looking at your sleep. And so I think, yeah, that's the Trojan horse, right? Terrible movie, passable doctor. Yeah, I like Taylor Kitsch. I like that actor a lot. I got this song in something called The Terminal List with Chris Pratt. My son's in the Navy, so he's like, we don't watch a show about Navy SEALs, and it was like B- kind of show. But Taylor Kitsch, I always think he's a really compelling actor. He's in Friday Night Lights too, which I really like.
I'm gonna just stop sharing for a second to see the
Yeah.
Hollywood squares for a second, yeah.
Yeah,
I don't know if others had any questions.
Yeah, actually, it was a great talk. I really love the data. I love sports, so I like thinking about sleep and sports. Couple things. One, have you ever looked at like umpires or referees and say how, the umpire calls balls and strikes compared to now they have the square on the TV so you could see if it was actually a ball or a strike? So
I've never heard of anything like that related to sort of the peripheral professionals related to sports, but when you look at NBA referees, their job's hard and they run. I mean, they're back and forth along the baseline the whole time. So, an NBA referee would be another one to look at as well too. But with the computerized strike zone thing, I'm curious if you can actually get a hold of the data for each one of those pitches. They show it when it's egregious and the manager's yelling and the player's throwing his bat, and then they kind of show the ball. It's like in tennis, that would be another good one too. The line judges in tennis, they have that technology now where when you dispute a call, are the disputes worth on the first day of the tournament when theoretically everybody's traveled to get to Dubai or wherever they're playing, and as it goes on, are things getting better or worse? But no, that's a great idea. That'd be a really, really cool project, and probably one that somebody could do without much act. It's like Scott Kutcher's project. You could do it without really any access. The information you need might be available to you already.
So one other thing I think is actually I have two more questions, but I think what's really great about I remember I was at the sleep meeting where the baseball data was presented, and I think about that study all the time. I think that's a great study. I love it. But I think it's even more important, say in the Olympics, you have people that are literally traveling around the world. It's like, there would be no better model to roll this out than Olympic athletes competing in, world championships, Olympics, because the swings are just huge. They're not just 3 time zones, they're the whole world.
And they also, the typical Olympic athlete doesn't have the money or the infrastructure to deal with it either. So the baseball players have every convenience in the world to them. They're only traveling across, 4 time zones. But you're absolutely right. And even beyond the Olympics, X Games, I work with a guy, his name's Terry Adams. He's a BMX rider, and he does these amazing bicycle tricks. You all should look up Terry Adams on Instagram or something. What he can do on a bicycle is amazing. This guy, he's in Rio, and then he's in Barcelona, and then he's in, Seattle. And like you said, there's much better models of travel and sleep than baseball or the typical sports we see in the United States. I mean, even European soccer travel much more distance at times than we do in the United States. So I agree with you. That's where you could really make a lot of noise. I think it's just that these poor teams, these players and organizations just don't have any money to fund it.
So one last question. So if you have an athlete that has narcolepsy, and for them to function even relatively normally, they need to be on a stimulant. Is that considered, performance enhancing, or is that just fixing a medical problem?
I would say both. So we've diagnosed narcolepsy players in Major League Baseball. The first time I did it, we encountered exactly what you're describing, because all the medications for narcolepsy were either on the banned list or they weren't, but not because not because somebody looked at the drug and said, well, they just weren't aware of the drug, like they weren't aware of oxybate, et cetera. So we had to deal with a player that had narcolepsy, but also at the same time work with Major League Baseball to establish a pathway. And so as we were going along with that, I felt like I was in a position where my interests were conflicted. So I actually said to Major League Baseball, I'm going to step aside and I'm going to give you the names of a few doctors that I think would be good to be your Major League Baseball impartial medical expert about narcolepsy. So the guy who represents the team and the player isn't driving the ship. And so I put forward a guy I worked with when I was in medical school, Dave Rye, down at Emory, and said, this guy is a narcolepsy hypersomnia expert and also sort of a hardliner. I consider myself, I don't think an MSLT diagnoses narcolepsy. I think it's a supportive study. It's not you have one sleep onset REM period, you don't have narcolepsy. I think that's foolish. So I tend to be softer in my views on narcolepsy. So he actually established a pathway so players can get these medications. It's quite a list you have to go through to get qualified for, but you can do it. I'll tell you a funny story. The other diagnosis that I fought for and lost was, hey, every one of your players in Major League Baseball is a shift worker. Essentially, as they travel back and forth across the country, if you look at the definition of what a shift worker is, a shift work disorder, they meet it. But they were like, no, we're not going there. So to your point, but another quick funny story. One day I was in clinic and this UPS driver came in and he said, I got a bunch of boxes for you. I guys put them on the ledge there. And he said, oh, there's way more boxes than that. And I said, okay, well, just put them in the conference room like this. So later in the day, I went to the conference room, just full of boxes of candy. It's like, man, all these boxes everywhere for. And my staff had no idea. And we found one that had a little note on it. It was from a baseball organization that was with this team, this player that I diagnosed narcolepsy and treated. And he said he doesn't eat the candy anymore. He was eating so much candy to stay awake that since you treated him, the candy just sits there and he doesn't mess with it. So we thought it'd be funny to send it to you. And a little quick note, food pantries, will take candy donations, which I was really happy about. So anyway, I kept one box of these weird green tea Kit Kats that were imported, I think, from like Korea or something. Like you couldn't get them in the United States, and yeah, eat one of those things, and you're good to go the rest of the day. So anyway, good question. Appreciate it. Bud.
Great talk. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Dr. Richard, thank you so much for coming, and it was very impactful, I think, for us to hear your work, and in a very public way. You do a lot of private things, but you're really impactful in the public dimension.
I appreciate it. It's nice to have the invitation.
And so I guess my question to you, is there any data on strategic timing of naps? We know naps can increase cognitive function, et cetera, but what about athletes? And, how would you advise someone to say, do you take a nap before a game? Do you take it 2 hours before a game? Because all these, a lot of athletes may not get enough sleep, and so they may have to nap. What is your advice?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Athletes are very protective about their napping ritual. So one thing I learned very quickly, and if you ever find yourself in that situation to file away, is to sort of tread gently with their napping in terms of, their athletes will take a 4-hour nap on a game day. Like they'll come in and do a little shoot around, go home and sleep for 4 hours and then come in. So I think you bring up a lot of points. The first point is the 4-hour nap because you were shortchanging yourself 4 hours at night?
Mm-hmm.
Is sort of the big question. So you're kind of dealing with an immature or an unusual polyphasic sleep schedule that you're trying to kind of fix. And then, a lot of them, they kind of build that nap into their ritual. It's like they get up, they come to the stadium, they get their treatments, The more senior players get to bat first, so they'll go out and do their batting practice. Then they come back inside and relax and rest, or that's when they'll like to take a nap. So a lot of times, what we're trying to do is help them sort of formalize it, instead of just napping whenever you want to, can we make it more of an appointment? Like it's part of the rituals that you kind of go through. Because a lot of players really believe it's like stepping on the white line. Like they believe they step on the white line, they're cursing their game. If they don't get their nap, they're kind of cursing it. So the napping, particularly with baseball, is kind of part of the culture. So you just gotta have to sometimes be very careful about that. So we try to make sure that they have good spaces to nap in, that they're not in, on a training table next to the loud music and everything. They have dedicated places to go to. We really try to get them sort of in the mindset of when you arrive there to take the nap, if you don't sleep, it's okay. So just getting into a place where you close your eyes, think about the pitcher or the team you're going to be playing today. What are some things you and your coach worked on, and how are you going to incorporate it into your game? Or thinking about the people you love, or something completely out, using them use, like kind of helping them understand that you're going to derive benefit from that period of time in that quiet area, even if you don't fall asleep. So now the nap does not become yet another performance expectation that they're going to pass or fail. In terms of the timing, that's really interesting. We often try to create a situation where there's plenty of time between the nap and when they start to play. And we try to get them into the habit of, okay, when the nap is over, just like when you're done with your main sleep period at night, let's get you into the light, maybe go into play the gym and get on the exercise bike. And so as soon as the nap's over, you always end it with light, warming up your body, exercise, social interaction, maybe some food. And you do that every time. So you can really kind of help with that sleep inertia or drunkenness that sometimes comes with that. So yeah, that's a really interesting topic, and one that I don't think I've ever seen anything about specific timings of naps. I do know teams keep data sometimes when they've got nap rooms of who's napping and who's not. But I think there's a lot more you can do with that too. Trying to help people. And they always like that. They always want you to write them one sheet. Like, can you give us a couple tips for, they always want you little tips and tricks for players, for napping. And I'm not sure you can make it quite that simple, but there are some things you can do just to, hey, maybe the 4-hour nap, not so much, maybe let's shorten it down to this time or whatever, and help people sort of understand a little more about that. But the nap is the window in terms of their own sleep habits at home.
Great. Well, another question I have is related to the chronotype. I think
Yeah.
that's really, really interesting, and that you asked about it. I know we asked about it in clinic too. So is there data on exercising according to your chronotype? So training, for example, I mean, maybe you can't control games, but you can control when you train.
Yeah.
Is there evidence to say that it's helpful to your a late chronotype? You exercise this time if you're an early morning riser this time.
Yeah, and this is, this sort of all relates to, all kinds, so the idea of, Colin Johnson and the daylight saving versus standard time, and the idea that even after some days pass when the time has changed, that misalignment that continues to be there is still a problem. And so I think that when you look at athletes, it's sort of the same thing that, we're trying to figure out ways to make everybody on the team athletically ready to perform at their time. And it's not an easy or even possible thing to do for everyone, but you can, for the super night oriented person, trying to move their chronotype a little bit with, more morning exercise, not sleeping in until 4 o'clock in the afternoons on days where they can. So there is evidence that shows that chronotype is influencing things. And one of the things that we fight against is, as players get older, they're getting married, they're having kids, they'll start to do things like get up early in the morning and do their entire 3-hour workout before their kids wake up. So in the off season, they're doing this, 5 to 8 a.m. intense workout. They get back, they want to be good parents, to help their partners out, and get the kids to school and do stuff. And then just kind of sitting around for the rest of the day. Spring training is kind of like that. They get up really early. I start player evaluations out at Goodyear where Cleveland has their spring training, like at, 5:45 is my first appointment. And so you're bringing everybody in on this crazy morning schedule. And then as soon as the season starts, you're playing at 7 p.m. So you've been training everybody to get up, be super, and they'll tell you that I'm a real night owl. When I come to spring training, after a week or two, I start waking up before the alarm goes off. So their chronotype is sort of moving if you believe that's a thing. And so you're kind of getting these people to start waking up before the sun goes up. And then suddenly on, some day in April, stop doing that, be ready to go at 7 p.m. when you've done nothing to sort of get people ready for that, which is fascinating to me. Even in the NBA, there was a guy for the Denver Nuggets who just won a championship that I worked with a long time ago. And he was such a morning person. So during training camp, he was amazing, but as the season went on, he just didn't perform particularly well. So, he got bumped around to a few different teams and I know through another person who does some stuff that we had a conversation about it. He's the nicest guy with this real health issues. That I was like, that guy just needs help pushing his rhythm out a little bit. He was just a morning person. He grew up in a family, I think somebody in the family was a minister or something. So like there's no sleeping in this guy's family, and God likes people who wake up 6 o'clock in the morning kind of thing. So he they really work with him to try to delay his circadian rhythm, and I think it really helped his performance. So I love thinking about those types of things, even with young people, trying to align their rhythms with when they want to perform their best. Even in school, like if you got a real night out kid, I don't think they should be doing algebra first period. Talking to the guidance counselor, can we make that study hall or gym class and make the calculus 6th period kind of thing? And I think those things can be really impactful to people.